Hi, Brady. Jeff Allen here. I'm giving kind of making this video about the my article that I wrote in, let's say it's 2002, and I check on it. I just complete. I just got a brand new computer, and I've backed up all my data for years onto another hard drive that's off in the corner there that I gotta plug back in. I gotta move back, and that's gonna take some work to go find the article and stuff and pull it up and all that stuff. And I. I just want to talk about because I know the topic. I don't need to have to show something here. I can explain it. So in 2002, I wrote an article in MultiLingual magazine. It was called MultiLingual Computing and Technology magazine back then, and it's now just MultiLingual for short. Um, and I wrote an article about using the Bible as an untapped database for training automatic translation systems. Now, I don't want to get into the training the automatic translation systems. Here's the topic. I want to explain why I wrote about that, and what is the value of it. Why it's really interesting. Because I brought this up the next year in a conference, and some of the colleagues and they just say, "Hey, this is really interesting. This approach." Um, and that article appeared in Multilingual magazine in 2002, and then in 2003 it was republished in the Localization Reader. Kind of highlighting a lot of the articles of the past year and kind of the key ones that were kind of interesting for in general ways. Um, so I'm trying to think here how I'd say this. The so the I'm going to summarize what the article talked about because it's like 8 pages long, and I don't want to go through it too long. But I kind of want to cover a lot of the highlights of that article without showing them the screen. I'm just going to explain it and why I'm going to call these multiple reference translations. And I'm actually doing some articles about this because this gets really geeky, semantic meaning wise, and I wrote some articles actually in college during my master's degree on multiple reference translations, and this is really interesting from especially when you're building translation systems. This is really interesting because you can have the thing is you can have multiple translations of anything, really, if you think about it. So let's take it from the perspective of just what I did in that article. I didn't come from a translation system perspective. I came from kind of just a general reader, a general person, and from the translation company perspective, because like translating the Bible is not a very it's not a very return on investment wise. It Any company, if they were going to do it, was trying to do translation the way that the Bible translation or associated did it, they would like go out of business like within a year. So because it's not the same purpose, and there's a reason for that. So what I said was that there are different angles to take this at one time here. So there are different types of translation methods. Okay. And these are usually not used because there are not always needs for it. So let's start with the thing is that if you've got translations that are usually like in any translation business, if you do multiple translations of a product or a service, of a document or whatever, or a video or whatever, doesn't matter, and you've got multiple translations of it, it usually means you screwed up the first time, okay, and you got to do another one by someone else. That's usually what it means, okay? The majority of the time. You just did a bad job, and so you got to redo it. Redo it, okay? That's the usual case, okay? Now, there are some exceptions to that, and those are the ones that I called like target audience adaptations. So I give an example of like kids' books. That I know my wife did one of these one time. She had to take a book and then she had to cut it. I'm going to call it. She had to kidify it. Okay, I kind of invent a word here. To kidify it means you take a book that's made for a general population. I don't want to see adult book because adult book can mean other things, right? So, but it's made for general readership, and then you want to make a child specific, easier comic book version type approach of explaining the same content and less words. And a shorter story rather than a longer, more complete story, right? So that's kind of, there's a reason to do that. And so the target audience changes. So that's why you make a different translation of it. So, not just translation, even a different version of it, even this in the source language doesn't matter. But then you do translations too. So you can do translations too. Um, so there's that. Those are reasons why you'd have multiple reference translations. And then you can have the right now, kind of the big thing right now is like the whole PCA thing, people-centered approach. And so you want to be a little more talking directly to user stuff. Now, usually you don't want to have one that's not, and then one that is PCA and one that isn't PCA. Just some people decide to go toward the PCA, but it does affect um, your translation, and it affects how your translation memories and authoring memories that you already built up for years, if they're going to be useful anymore. Because you start changing completely, it's going to mess it up. Um, Another example where you might have multiple references, and this is usually in a transition. And go watch my authoring memory video about this because I actually explain all this. I have two videos on authoring memory. I gave more examples of it. Um, and there's one like where you're going to go into like a revised type of writing called controlled language or something, and she might make a controlled language version of writing, and you're going to move towards that. That happens, but that's a very, you've got a reason why you're going to do this. So those are some examples. Go watch those authoring memory and the authoring memory examples videos about that, because that'll give a little more in depth about this topic, that specific reasons. But I want to come back to the one about the Bible, and which I just briefly mentioned in the authoring memory one. The video. The thing with the Bible is that usually, so you've got different. The Bible's actually written, is written in Hebrew for the Hebrew and Aramaic for the Old Testament. Actually, well, Hebrew in the Old Testament, and then the Greek and then Aramaic for the New Testament, mainly Greek, Koine Greek, and those are old versions of the language that are spoken today. So you've got new modern Hebrew and new modern Greek, which are different. So no one speaks those languages anymore as a native language, so they can study it, and you can study it. And the thing is, the people that study it and get to that level, that can do that kind of level translation, they've done a bachelor's degree and they've done a master's degree and they got a PhD, and those are usually master's in theology and a THD, a doctorate in theology, which are like 4 years plus 4 years plus 4 years, or no, yeah, 4. Yeah, it's 12 years of stuff. Really, very focused. See, it's not like you're not like a translator. You just decide, you wake up one day and say, "Hey, I want to be a translator. I'm bilingual, so I can kind of do this." And people do that. People can do it, or subject matter experts who are, can speak other languages. They can do this too. They just know it. But usually, you don't do 12 years to become a subject matter expert, even in some areas. But this one you got it, because these are dead languages. So to be able to do that and to be able to translate from the Septuagint, which was a translation from Greek into Latin, then you got to translate from the Latin into, whatever the modern language is today. So that's kind of the background of that article talks about, because I'm talking about a translation perspective, how companies and translation companies kind of get into this, and they would never make a business out of it. They try to do translation like that, and on top of it, the the Bible there are four or five different approaches to how you do translation. You choose your approach. See, usually when a translation company is going to translate something, like the iPhone or computer documentation or whatever, my headset, documentation, headset installation, user instructions. You don't think about which approach of translation I'm going to use. Okay, you don't do that. You just say I'm going to translate something that the user's going to be able to use and put the headset on and use it, or going to be able to use the iPhone or whatever. Okay, but you don't think about which type of translation I'm going to do. Well, that's what you do with the Bible. Okay, so that's why it's really important to get to do that. So you got one type of translation of the Bible. It's called interlinear. Okay, interlinear, and what that is that you've got an interlinear we also call it gloss translations. We tend to call them gloss, translations in linguistics as well. Interlinear is a thing that we talk about usually when you're talking about if you're going to be doing translation, and usually when we talk about the Greek or the interlinears use that because what is just text, and you're putting the words in, and you're sometimes not just putting words, you're putting other information and meta language stuff like this is a third person plural something. Um, well, actually, those are two different. Those are actually two different translations. Sorry, I got two different things here. This gets. This is my master's, my doctor's thesis. It's like gets into this. Um, so an, so a gloss is what happens. You've got. I should have put. I should pull up the article. I should pull up my master, my doctoral thesis and show. What you do is you have the original language, usually written, and then you have what's called a gloss. And a gloss is not words, it's explanation, descriptions of what each of the words is. So for a verb, you might say third person, this is a this is a this is a this is a this is going to be a third person plural. I say that could, yeah. Now, first person plural collective, inclusive we, um, for the verb something. That's what a gloss would do. And what it helps you do is read, it helps you understand it. You're kind of breaking down each of the words in the sentence into the concepts that are underneath it, behind it. And you might say, actually, too, for like a noun, you'd say, the accusative, or the genitive of such and such noun. So that kind of thing. Um, and and then you say, single plural and all this kind of stuff. So plural genitive or plural accusative or plural dative of such and such noun, rock. Okay, whatever. I'm just trying to give some examples here. Um, I'm not thinking about the words themselves. I'm just kind of giving an example. So that's what a gloss would do. So it breaks it down to concepts. So when you read it, you can kind of break it down, saying, "Oh, okay, that's how it's playing, and that's how it's playing with the other words in the meaning in the sentence." Okay. Then you have an interlinear, which is just taking the actual literal translations of each word and making them available, and it can be kind of like it not very it's not very easy to understand in interlinear because it's just words and it's just literal giving literal translations along the way. So that's interlinear. So it's usually for studying purposes. It's really for studying and in-depth studying things. It's not for consumption. No human being would able to read to think it's like, don't even give it a computer. It's for study purposes, for digging down into analyzing, what that does that do those words mean in that sentence. This kind of linguistic geek stuff. So then you have, so those are actually two different types of translations or transliterations or what do you want to call that, okay? Or concept translation. I kind of want to be general in the word translation. Could it be, gloss is not translation. It's kind of a transliteration. It's an intermediate kind of. It's another code. It's another code. Okay, so it's just trying to explain things in coding. We could actually you could take binary code and you could kind of I'll take all the letters and break them down, 26 letters or 26 different variants. You could do mathematical coding of, letters too. And just reading and make people just totally unreadable. But it's another encoding process. So there's those. And then you've got different translation approaches for the Bible. And that's why I think it's really important to understand because that gives the reason why you do that version. Okay. I think that's really important to understand. So one of the types of translations that is done beyond the interlinear approach, okay, is a literal approach. And what you want to do when you do a literal approach is that you focus on the source language as the reference. So the source language, or I should be doing this with my left hand because most of these things are left to right. I'll do it for my hand. I just got to do it different. So the source language is the one that's the reference that you want to always refer back to. And you want it to be the source of truth, the source translation. I'm not saying the Bible's the truth here. Okay? I'm just saying that the source translation of a documented thing is the source of truth. That's what we call these things. Um, and anything that comes and explains it, it's always referring back to the source of truth, okay, of the content. So, and everything else is just a description coming back to that source of truth. Um, and so you want it to be the words that are used. You want the words that were in the source language to be the ones that are going to be referred to in the translation. You're going to get it as close as you can, literally, in the other language. It's got to be as literal as possible. And so this can make translations that are literal translations of the Bible, and there are, um, and there are some of them that are known to be more literal than others. So King James is kind of more a literal translation. King James Version is one of those, and there are others. Um, and it has, but it's hard to read. And it wasn't, necessarily the common day spoken English actually back in the 17th century either. Yeah, it kind of was, but today it's like harder to read. Okay, you know, talk to kids that try to memorize Bible verses, the King James version. Like, oh boy, that kind of hard not working out. When you gotta kind of play it because it's also the thee and thou stuff, but it's more than that. It's just the way the wording is. It's tough. So you gotta have to memorize this stuff. It's just doesn't flow as you do like I'm speaking right now in my modern day spoken dialect of English, American English. Okay, um, so King James is one type of or literal translation of one type of approach because again, it's the source language. The source language is the reference. Now you get other types of versions like dynamic translations. That's an approach to doing translation, which is where it's no longer the source language that's important, it's the target language that's important because you want the reader to have a good user experience, okay? And they didn't talk about this is the whole idea of user experience. Now, user experience is a big thing, but back when they were doing dynamic translations of the Bible, like in the 1980s, was when about that time when it all kind of started happening with some different new international version. There were a few, but the new international version, kind of 1980s, kind of took that off and there were some others too, but I'm going to get into those other types because there's slightly different types of this as well. It was kind of getting to we want to make it more flowing we want it more readable for the user, the person reading. So we have a dynamic translation, which again does not focus on the source so much. It's not saying you just give it up. It's just that the source, the words, the literal translations are not so much important as it being able for that you when you read it in the target language, it makes sense in the target language, whereas the literal stuff doesn't always quite make sense. I mean, it's hard to, it's not, yeah, you know what I mean. So then you have another level of that are you've got I'll say too that when you're doing both the literal translation and the dynamic translation, you're going from the source language into the target language. You're not using pivot languages, okay? And a pivot language is using another intermediate language to make it to be able to jump off that and make it easy because you simplified it into one language and another language and simplified it to go into another language. So it's a pivot language. Now, there are another type of translation that is available for the Bible, are what we call paraphrases, and those are pivot language. Um, sometimes they can be pivot language, and sometimes they're not. So, like there are ones like the Good News Bible; it's a pivot language. So, they simplified it to an easy to read one that is. They've taken another existing translation into English, and they've simplified that even more, and paraphrased it into still another more usable and readable user experience. And this tends to be for like populations that don't you have English as a first mother tongue. It's like a second language. So like the whole Bible, when they had that thing for like the people in the Philippines and stuff, it's not their English in their mother tongue, but you use that. People would use that to be able to explain things with that English version because it's easier to read than actually in the dynamic translations. And it's really easy to read. And there are like lots of versions of that, and I can think about this. And Good News is a kind of example. That's a paraphrase. It's not a direct translation. It's a paraphrase because you've gone through an existing translation to get to another one to make it simpler, or you've gone through a paraphrase from one language to another. Okay, kind of. I mean, I'm trying not to explain all the details here because this is this can be a long book. I don't want to go into a book, but I got to explain this because this is why it's important. So you got paraphrase translations. Okay, so there's that. That's another reason to do a translation. You want to make it even easier. Simplified is usually um, the plain language, and simplified language is kind of a good example of that. It's even simpler than the dynamic stuff. Then you got another type of translation. Yeah, boy, I keep coming up with these translation types. You think I'm inventing things? No way. This is actually true. This is how people do it. Um, and they have to think about the reason that your translation approach, depending what your target audience is. Um, and then you've got cultural translations. Yeah, we got those too. What is a cultural adaptation? Cultural adaptation is in the Bible. I'm just going to take some examples. Like, so John the Baptist went down to the Jordan River to, within something, in this region of, he was doing that probably in the Jordan, so that was not Galilee. That was more down lower. He was it was not son of Nazareth because that was Jesus born in Nazareth, but I thought it was around Galilee. I'm just I can't remember exactly here, so I'm just kind of I got to use some examples. Now, what happened in the cultural translation? God forbid that we do this kind of thing, but it actually does happen. Is rather than referring to the actual place names of the source document. What you do is you adapt it to a target audience and use the place names of that new location. Yes, it does happen. So one of these is called the Cotton Patch Bible. The Cotton Patch Bible, yeah, for the South of the U.S. And it would translate the river names to, it wouldn't be the Jordan River, it'd be the Mississippi River, okay? And and rather than talking about Galilee or whatever, Galilee, I'm sorry, I'm thinking of French here, so Galilee, um, or Nazareth or Bethlehem or whatever, we're going to be talking about Atlanta, Georgia. Well, not next to the Mississippi River, but you get it what I mean. Hey, this is St. Louis, Missouri. Yeah, I said Missouri, right? So, yeah, I'm St. Louis, Missouri, and or this is somewhere in Alabama or somewhere in Tennessee, or you see what I mean? Um, and then you defer to not the mountain range, so or, you're not going to talk about Mount of Olives or something. We're going to talk about like the Appalachian Mountains, okay? So that's what happens in the cultural adaptation in the Bible. Um, so those do happen too. No, those are kind of they're not so accepted, but hey, it does exist, and it's a reason to do it. And some people actually do this. So what happens is when there are committees that decide to go and do another translation of the Bible, I mean, they're like, I don't know how many English versions there are. I'm thinking there are about, you got to go up and look on some kind of website that does this. I think like Gateway, Bible Gateway, I think it's called. They got this, and they got all the different translations. So you can actually look up all the different ones. So this, and for different languages too, you can look at the ones in French and all that. So it's possible to get all these different ones. So it's really helpful to have all this. And those are not all the ones that exist. Those are the ones that they've allowed to be made publicly available because these are copyrighted too. So you got to get in that whole thing. But so you can kind of choose the one you want, but each translation was made for a specific purpose. Okay, it was made for a reason and translated for a reason. It was a lot of time was put in. I mean, a lot of time was put in those translations. Some of those things can take. I think what they said I think I recall saying that the newer international versions, the NIV of the Bible, took like 30 years. Okay, and a lot of translations that are happen to exotic languages. I want to call them exotic languages because I don't want to say minority languages because people want to shoot me for saying that word. But um, all the languages other than European and general languages, all European languages, it's the rest of the world other than those and Asian languages. But um, the rest of the world, all these other languages, those are like 20-year jobs. There's a long-term stuff. Depends if you can kind of if you can piggyback off of another language that's already been done, that helps. But if you can't, you got to do it all from the start. And you got to go listen to it and actually go to and start listening to the clip. You got to start actually phonetic writing and phonetics and stuff and listening to what they're saying. Then you got to create an alphabet for it, and you got it's a long-term job. And then when you start getting the translations, you get into like, well, and this kind of thing when so and so, and he in the Bible when he was, walking on the water and healing the people and casting out demons or something. I mean, I'm just trying to give a bunch of examples of those things here. That what are the choices of the words that you're doing that? And sometimes there are choices of words that are kind of tough to do, and they cause a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, debate. Some kinds of things of like sacrifice, the word sacrifice, and what does that mean in another language, in that local language, somewhere in who knows where in the world, you know, yeah, try to adapt it so that it makes sense in that language too, right? So, and there just is never always a literal example, right? So you got to find something that's culturally close enough. And so you kind of sometimes you have to do this multiple approaches to try to get a word even for whatever the version you're going to do. So that's kind of the overview of that article about Bible translation. And and what I do is I like to do linguistic analyses off of biblical text because they got this reference, the multiple reference stuff. It's really cool for doing when you want to do when you want to figure out how you want to, like for translation systems are really cool because in translation system you you want to say it in one way, but it's the Bible has all these different approaches to saying the same sentence 20 different ways or 30 different ways in one language, but in the same language, but in different kind of, yeah, these what I've just explained, all these semantically different meanings for saying the same thing. And so it's really good for when you're building a translation system, but it's also good for linguistic analysis too, and things. So I do it for a lot of my. I did a paper in master's degree on. I think I was analyzing. I was doing a semantic role analysis, a thematic role or semantic role analysis. So that's semantics off of the Psalm 23 because of like four different versions. That was really interesting because you're getting a different meaning if you're working from a semantic role or thematic role. Basically, case logic. So it's got all the things of kind of case-based systems, languages. If you're taking that approach, accusative, dative, and locative, and instrumental, and all that kind of stuff, and nominative, and so if you're taking it from that point of view, then you're seeing things differently than if you're just doing it from a traditional grammatical approach, syntax view. Um, and that's really cool for doing linguistic analysis. So, and then figure out things and doing a little more depth and seeing why that translation is done a certain way. So I'll make another video about that one. But 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 when you take all these translations of all these verses, and you got 25 different flavors of translations of the same verse, then you begin to look at it. What does it mean? What does it mean? And so this is kind of cool for doing for different reasons and all that. But this is why I wrote that article to explain this. In Multilingual Magazine 2002 and in Localization Reader 2003. It's up on my website. So you can look it up actually my LinkedIn. It's up on the multilingual.com as well. Under Jeff Allen's the Bible, using the Bible. I can't remember the exact name. Using the Bible is an untapped language database for machine translation systems or something like that. I don't have the article name in front of me, but it's pretty close to that. So, and the article might interest you reading that, and hopefully this video has made it. It gives you a little bit to dig deeper into why that the stuff and just explain that article. But sometimes the video people like to watch the video and understand that a little bit too, and it allows me to talk a little bit more about the things I didn't cover in the video in the article at the time because it's been like that was 20 years ago. So yeah, it's been 20 years. Wow. So but yeah, so that should helpfully hope that and explain that. Okay, thanks.